The morning mist clung to the jagged cliffs like ghostly fingers, obscuring the narrow ledges where Crag made his solitary home. High above the valley floor, his cave offered both shelter and isolation, exactly what he had sought for the past 3 seasons since leaving his former band. The entrance was barely wide enough for his broad shoulders, but inside, the chamber opened into a space large enough for a small fire and his meager possessions. Crag's weathered hands worked methodically as he sharpened a flint spear tip, the scraping sound echoing softly against the stone walls. His heavy brow ridge cast deep shadows over his dark eyes that had seen too much loss, too much betrayal. The thick muscles of his arms and chest bore numerous scars, some from hunts gone wrong, others from the final confrontation that had driven him from his people. His coarse hair, streaked with premature grey, hung in matted tangles around his face, framing features that spoke of countless harsh winters and brutal summers. The fire crackled weakly, fed by the last of his dried dung and precious twigs. Outside, the wind howled through the mountain passes, carrying with it the promise of another harsh day. Crag paused in his work, listening to the familiar sounds of his isolation. No voices called his name, no children laughed nearby. No elders shared wisdom around a communal fire, just the endless whisper of wind and the occasional cry of a distant predator echoing through the stone corridors of his mountain fortress. His stomach clenched with familiar hunger, a constant companion these days. The dried meat strips hanging from a crude wooden frame were nearly depleted, perhaps enough for 2 more days if he rationed carefully. The nuts he had gathered during the brief autumn harvest were already showing signs of mold, their shells soft and discolored. Winter was approaching fast, heralded by the increasingly bitter winds and the thin layer of ice that formed each morning on the stone ledges. Alone, his chances of surviving it grew slimmer each day, but still he could not bring himself to return to any band. The memory of that terrible night haunted him constantly. Mira's face, once so full of life and laughter, frozen in death, her blood warm and sticky on his hands as he held her broken body. The accusations that followed, whispered at first, then shouted with increasing fury. Murderer, they had called him. Betrayer. The elder's words still rang in his ears. You bring death wherever you walk, Crag. Leave us before you destroy us all. He had tried to explain, to make them understand that he had been trying to save her, that the mammoth's charge had been impossible to predict, but grief and fear had poisoned their hearts against him. Even those who had once called him brother turned their backs when he reached out for understanding. So he had gathered his few possessions and walked into the wilderness, seeking a place where his curse could harm no one else. A sound broke through his dark reverie, something that didn't belong to the mountain's natural symphony. Crag's head snapped up, his grip tightening on the spear shaft. There it was again, a thin, desperate cry that made his chest tighten with unexpected emotion. It wasn't the call of any animal he knew. It was weaker, more fragile, more human. The sound carried an urgency that cut through his carefully constructed walls of indifference, awakening instincts he thought he had buried forever. Setting down his weapon, Crag moved to the cave entrance and peered out into the grey morning. The mist swirled below like a living thing, obscuring the rocky slopes that led down to the valley. But the sound came again, closer now, and unmistakably, the cry of distress from something, or someone, very young. It was the kind of cry that spoke of abandonment, of hunger, of desperation so complete that death seemed preferable to another moment of suffering. Against every instinct that had kept him alive and hidden for so long, Crag found himself stepping out onto the narrow ledge. His bare feet, toughened by years of rocky terrain, found purchase on the slippery stone as he began his descent. The cries grew stronger, more desperate, tugging at something deep within him that he thought had died with Mira. Each plaintive wail seemed to pierce directly through his ribs and twist around his heart, demanding action despite the danger it might bring. The descent was treacherous, made worse by the mist that clung to every surface like damp fur. Crag's powerful hands gripped the rough stone as he lowered himself from ledge to ledge, his thick fingers finding holds that would have been impossible for smaller, weaker beings. The cold bit at his exposed skin, but he ignored the discomfort, driven by an urgency he couldn't fully understand. His heart pounded not from exertion, but from a fear he couldn't name. Fear of what he might find, fear of what it might mean for his carefully guarded solitude, fear that he might once again be faced with a life he was powerless to save. As he rounded a jutting outcrop, The mist parted momentarily like a curtain being drawn aside, and Crag's breath caught in his throat. Below him, huddled against a boulder barely larger than itself, was a small figure that made his chest constrict with unexpected pain. Even from a distance, he could see the thin arms reaching upward, the tiny face turned skyward in desperate supplication. The cries that had drawn him from his cave came from a child, abandoned, starving, and utterly alone in this merciless landscape. Crag's descent became more urgent, his thick fingers scraping against the stone as he lowered himself with reckless speed. Each cry from below seemed to tear at something fundamental within him, awakening protective instincts that transcended his self-imposed exile. When he finally reached the narrow shelf where the child lay, he stopped short, his breath forming small clouds in the cold morning air. It was an infant, no more than 2 seasons old by his estimation. The tiny body was wrapped in what had once been animal hide, now torn and filthy from exposure. The child's skin had the grayish pallor of severe malnutrition, stretched tight over bones that seemed too large for the emaciated frame. Most heartbreaking of all were the eyes, large, dark, and filled with a desperate hunger that went far beyond the need for food. They were eyes that had seen too much abandonment, too much suffering for such a young life. "Shh," Crag whispered, his voice rusty from disuse. He knelt beside the infant, his massive hands hovering uncertainly over the tiny form. The child's cries intensified at his presence, small fists waving weakly in the air. Crag could see the infant's ribs clearly outlined beneath the paper-thin skin, could count each vertebra along the curved spine. This little one was dying, perhaps only hours away from joining the mountain's collection of scattered bones. Gently, more gently than he had touched anything since Mira's death, Crag lifted the infant into his arms. The child weighed almost nothing, like holding a bundle of sticks wrapped in hide. The tiny head lolled against his broad chest, and he felt the rapid, fluttering heartbeat through his thick skin. The infant's breathing was shallow and labored, each breath a struggle that might be the last. "Where are your people, little one?" Crag murmured, his eyes scanning the surrounding cliffs and valleys. There were no signs of a recent camp, no abandoned fires or scattered bones that would indicate a band had passed this way. The child must have been carried here from a great distance, or perhaps had crawled this far in search of help. Either possibility spoke of a desperation that made Crag's own suffering seem insignificant. The infant's cries had weakened to barely audible whimpers, and Crag felt panic rising in his chest. He had seen death approach many times, in wounded hunters, in elders whose time had come, in the eyes of prey animals as life faded from their bodies. This child was walking the same path, and without immediate help would not see another sunrise. Making a decision that would change both their lives forever, Crag began the treacherous climb back to his cave. With one massive arm cradling the infant against his chest, he used his free hand to grip the stone holds, his powerful legs driving him upward despite the awkward burden. The child's tiny fingers had somehow found purchase in his thick chest hair, clinging with the last desperate strength of the dying. The ascent seemed to take forever. Each movement had to be calculated, each hold tested before trusting it with their combined weight. The mist continued to swirl around them, making the stones slippery and the handholds treacherous. More than once, Crag felt his foot slip, felt the momentary terror of potential fall that would dash them both against the rocks below. But something drove him upward, perhaps the memory of Mira, perhaps the need to prove that his hands could preserve life as well as take it. When they finally reached the cave entrance, Crag was gasping with exertion and stress. The infant had grown ominously quiet during the climb, the tiny body disturbingly still against his chest. For a terrifying moment, he thought he was too late, that he was carrying a corpse instead of a living child. But when he pressed his ear close to the small face, he could still feel the whisper of breath against his skin. Inside the cave, Crag quickly rekindled his fire, feeding it precious fuel until flames danced high enough to warm the stone chamber. He laid the infant on a bed of his softest furs, carefully unwrapping the tattered hide that served as clothing. What he found beneath made his jaw clench with anger and sorrow. The child's body told a story of prolonged neglect and abandonment. Old bruises decorated the tiny limbs, and what appeared to be bite marks, perhaps from scavenging animals, marred the thin arms. But it was the obvious starvation that affected Crag most deeply. This infant had been slowly dying for days, perhaps weeks, sustained only by an incredible will to live that defied all reason. Looking at his depleted stores of food, Crag made another decision that surprised him. He took one of his precious strips of dried meat and began to chew it thoroughly. softening the tough fibers with his saliva until it became a paste that tiny teeth could manage. The taste was rich and smoky, a flavor he had been rationing carefully for his own survival. Now, without hesitation, he was preparing to share it with a stranger's child. With infinite patience, Crag used his finger to transfer the softened meat paste to the infant's lips. At first there was no response. The tiny mouth remained slack, the eyes unfocused and glazed. Fear gripped his heart as he wondered if he had already waited too long, if the spark of life had finally flickered out during their difficult ascent to the cave. "Come, little fighter," he whispered, his voice carrying a tenderness that surprised him. "You must eat. You must live." He gently touched the paste to the infant's tongue, hoping to trigger some instinctive response. For long, agonizing moments, nothing happened. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, the tiny tongue moved, tasting the unfamiliar substance. The reaction was immediate and desperate. The infant's mouth opened wider, small hands reaching weakly toward Krag's finger. The child began to suck and lick at the offered food with an urgency that spoke of prolonged starvation. Each tiny swallow seemed to bring a spark of life back to the dimming eyes, each morsel of victory against the encroaching shadow of death. Crag found himself holding his breath as he watched the feeding, afraid that any sudden movement might break the fragile spell. The infant's stomach, shrunken from lack of food, could only accept small amounts at a time. After several mouthfuls, the child's body rejected the richness, and Crag had to support the tiny head, as weak retching shook the emaciated frame. But even this was a good sign. The body was fighting to survive, struggling to process nutrition after so long without it. "Easy, small one," Crag murmured, wiping the infant's face with a scrap of soft hide. "We go slowly. Your belly must remember how to hold food." The words felt strange on his tongue. He had not spoken so much or so gently in many seasons. The sound of his own voice in the cave, addressing another living being, awakened memories of a time when communication was as natural as breathing. As the afternoon wore on, Crag continued the careful feeding process. Between small offerings of food, he used precious water from his gourd to clean the infant's face and hands, washing away the grime and dried tears that spoke of days of abandonment. The child's skin, though still alarmingly thin, began to show the faintest hint of warmth and color. More importantly, the desperate edge had left the crying. When the infant fussed now, it was with the normal irritation of discomfort rather than the existential terror of the dying. During the quiet moments between feedings, Crag studied the child more carefully. The bone structure suggested this was a male infant, probably born during the last warm season. The facial features were delicate, but unmistakably hominid, the pronounced brow ridge just beginning to develop, the broad nose and strong jaw that would serve him well in the harsh world they inhabited. Most striking were the eyes, which had grown more alert with each feeding, following Crag's movements with an intelligence that suggested a quick mind despite the traumatic circumstances. "What happened to your people, little wolf?" Crag asked softly, using the term of endearment his own mother had favored. "Where is your mother? Your father?" The questions hung in the air unanswered, but Crag found himself constructing possible explanations. Perhaps the band had been attacked by predators or rival hunters. Perhaps disease had swept through their group, leaving only this one small survivor. Perhaps resources had become so scarce that they had been forced to abandon their weakest members to save the rest. Each possibility filled him with a mixture of anger and sorrow. He knew the harsh realities of survival, understood that sometimes impossible choices had to be made. But looking at this innocent child, seeing the trust that was already beginning to bloom in those dark eyes, Crag felt his heart hardening against whatever circumstances had led to this abandonment. As evening approached and the cave grew darker, Crag built up the fire until it cast dancing shadows on the stone walls. The infant had managed to keep down several small meals and was now sleeping fitfully on the bed of furs, tiny chest rising and falling with slightly stronger breaths. The improvement was remarkable but fragile. Crag knew that the child was far from safe, that many more days of careful nursing would be needed before recovery was assured. Sitting beside the sleeping infant, Crag found himself making mental calculations about his food supplies. The dried meat that had been carefully rationed to last through the worst of winter would now need to be shared. His stored nuts and roots would have to stretch further. The hunting that had already been challenging for one experienced adult would now carry the additional pressure of feeding a dependent child. But as he watched the small face, peaceful now in sleep, Crag realized that these practical concerns felt secondary to a deeper truth that was awakening within him. For the first time since Mira's death, since his exile from the band, he felt a sense of purpose that went beyond mere survival. This child needed him, not just for food and shelter, but for protection, for care, for the kind of devoted attention that only comes from genuine love. The thought should have terrified him. Love had brought him nothing but pain. Love had led him to make the desperate attempt to save Mira that had ultimately cost her life. Love had made him vulnerable to the accusations and rejections that had driven him into exile. But looking at this helpless infant, feeling the fierce protectiveness that was already growing in his chest, Crag found he could not resist the call of this new attachment. "Tomorrow we hunt together, little wolf," he whispered into the firelit darkness. "Tomorrow we begin to build a life worth living." Outside the cave, the wind continued its eternal howl through the mountain passes, but for the first time in many seasons, Crag felt he was no longer facing it alone. 5 days passed in a rhythm of careful feeding, watchful nursing, and gradual healing. The infant, whom Crag had begun calling Locke, meaning little light, in the ancient tongue of his birth band, grew stronger with each sunrise. The greyish pallor slowly gave way to healthier colouring, and the skeletal thinness began to fill out as the tiny body remembered how to process regular nutrition. Crag found himself adapting to a routine he had never experienced before. His days now revolved entirely around Locke's needs, preparing soft foods, monitoring the child's breathing during sleep, changing the improvised wrappings made from strips of his own clothing. The solitary hunter, who had lived by his own schedule for 3 seasons, now measured time by feeding intervals and sleep cycles. The transformation in both of them was remarkable. Locke's eyes had regained their spark, following Crag's movements with increasing interest and recognition. The desperate dying cries had been replaced by the normal sounds of a healthy infant, babbling vocalizations, small grunts of contentment after feeding, and even what might have been attempts at laughter when Crag made exaggerated facial expressions during their interactions. For Crag, the changes ran even deeper. The crushing weight of isolation that had pressed down on him since his exile was lifting gradually, replaced by a sense of purpose and connection that he had thought lost forever. His movements around the cave had gained a new carefulness, a constant awareness of the small presence that now shared his space. Even his voice had changed, becoming softer, more melodic when he spoke to Locke during feeding times, or when the infant grew restless during the long mountain nights. "You are growing strong, little wolf," Crag murmured during the morning feeding, watching as Locke eagerly accepted the pre-chewed meat paste. "Soon you will be ready for harder foods. Soon you will learn to walk these mountain paths with me." The words carried a certainty that surprised him. Somewhere during these days of nursing, Crag had stopped thinking of this arrangement as temporary. Locke was no longer just a rescued infant. He was becoming Crag's son in every way that mattered. But the practical challenges of their situation could not be ignored indefinitely. Crag's food stores were depleting faster than anticipated, and winter was approaching with relentless certainty. The morning frost now lingered longer on the cave entrance, and the winds carried the sharp bite of snow from the higher peaks. Soon, the treacherous paths down the mountain would become impossible to navigate, trapping them in the cave until the spring thaw. More concerning were the signs that others had been in the area. On his brief foraging expeditions, never straying far from the cave while Locke slept, Crag had noticed footprints in the muddy ground near the stream below. The tracks were recent, made by several individuals traveling together. The pattern of their movement suggested they were searching for something or someone rather than following established hunting routes. The discovery filled Crag with a cold dread that went far beyond concern for his own safety. If these tracks belonged to the people who had abandoned Locke, their presence here might mean they were having second thoughts about their decision. Perhaps they had hoped the child would die quickly, eliminating a burden while salving their consciences. The infant's survival might represent an unwelcome complication to whatever plans they had made. Alternatively, the tracks might belong to an entirely different band, one that viewed any unknown presence in their territory as a threat to be eliminated. Crag's isolated cave, once a sanctuary, could quickly become a trap if hostile hunters decided to investigate the source of the smoke from his fire or the sounds of activity from the cliff face. That evening, as Locke slept peacefully on the bed of furs, Crag sat by the fire and made weapons. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, napping flint into sharp points, strengthening wooden shafts, testing the balance and weight of each completed spear. The familiar motions were soothing, reminding him of skills that had kept him alive through countless dangers. But now the stakes felt infinitely higher. He was no longer protecting just himself. He had a child to defend, a small life that depended entirely on his strength and cunning. The irony was not lost on him. For 3 seasons, he had sought isolation to avoid bringing harm to others. Now, by choosing to save Locke, he had once again made himself responsible for another's welfare. The protective instincts that had failed him so catastrophically with Mira were awakening again, stronger and more focused than ever before. As he worked, Crag found himself speaking quietly to the sleeping infant, sharing thoughts and concerns that he had never voiced aloud. "I will not let them take you, little wolf. I will not let anyone hurt you, as they have already hurt you. We will face whatever comes together, and we will survive it together." The words were both promise and prayer, a commitment that went beyond rational thought into something more fundamental and unbreakable. Outside the cave, an owl called through the darkness, a lonely sound that once would have perfectly matched Crag's own emotional state. But tonight, with Locke's soft breathing providing a gentle counterpoint to the night sounds, the owl's cry seemed less like an echo of solitude and more like a warning. Something was stirring in the valley below, something that would soon test the strength of the bond that had formed between the lone hominid and the child he had chosen to save. Crag set aside his completed weapons and moved to check on Locke one more time before allowing himself to sleep. The infant's face was peaceful, unmarked by the fears and uncertainties that plagued the adult world. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions, new tests of resolve. But tonight, in the warmth of the firelit cave, they were safe. Tonight they were family. The morning of the 7th day brought with it an unsettling change in the mountain's rhythm. Crag woke before dawn, not to Locke's usual stirring, but to a silence so profound it seemed to press against his eardrums like a physical weight. The normal sounds of the mountain, the scurrying of small creatures, the distant calls of birds, the whisper of wind through stone crevices, had all ceased, as if the entire landscape was holding its breath in anticipation of something terrible. Locke slept peacefully beside him, tiny fist curled against his cheek, unaware of the tension that had settled over their sanctuary like a suffocating blanket. Crag's instincts, honed by years of survival in hostile territory, screamed warnings that he could not yet identify. Every fiber of his being told him that danger was approaching, but the nature and source of that danger remained hidden in the pre-dawn darkness. Moving with the silent grace of a predator, Crag crept to the cave entrance and peered out into the grey twilight. The mist was thinner today, offering better visibility across the valley floor and the surrounding ridges. What he saw there made his blood run cold, and his grip tighten unconsciously on the spear shaft he had carried to the entrance. Smoke. Not the thin, careful wisps from a single family fire, but thick columns that spoke of a large encampment. Multiple fires, many people, a gathering that had appeared overnight like some manifestation of his darkest fears. The smoke rose from the valley directly below his cave, close enough that he could make out individual figures moving between the fires like shadows in the growing light. Even from this distance, Crag could see that this was no ordinary hunting party or family group. The sheer number of bodies moving in the camp below suggested a band larger than any he had encountered during his years of exile. Worse, their positioning seemed deliberately chosen to control the main routes up and down the mountain. They had not simply happened upon this location, they had selected it with tactical precision. As the dawn light strengthened, more details became visible. Crag counted at least 40 individuals in the camp, possibly more obscured by the remaining mist and the rocky terrain. They moved with the coordinated efficiency of a well-organized band, establishing watchposts, preparing weapons, arranging their camp in defensive patterns that spoke of extensive combat experience. These were not peaceful hunters following game trails. They were warriors prepared for conflict. The most chilling detail was the way some of them occasionally looked up toward the cliff face where his cave was hidden. Even if they could not see the entrance directly, they clearly knew something was up there. Perhaps they had spotted the smoke from his fire during their approach. Perhaps they had found other signs of his presence during their reconnaissance. Whatever had drawn their attention, Crag felt exposed and vulnerable in a way he had not experienced since his earliest days of exile. Retreating deeper into the cave, Crag began to make rapid preparations for what might be their last day of safety. He gathered his weapons, checked the sharpness of each point, tested the tension of his improvised slings. His movements were swift but silent, driven by an urgency that made his hands shake with barely controlled adrenaline. Every few moments, he glanced toward Locke, still sleeping peacefully, and felt his heart contract with fierce protectiveness. The child had no idea that their small world was about to be shattered. In Locke's innocent perception, Crag was simply the source of food, warmth, and safety, a constant presence who had transformed his existence from one of desperate suffering to comfortable security. The infant had no way of understanding that the same hands that fed him so gently were now preparing for violence, that the voice that had whispered such tender words was now silently planning strategies for defending their cave against overwhelming odds. As the morning progressed, Crag made a series of discoveries that deepened his growing dread. When he ventured to the very edge of his ledge to observe the camp below, he could see that the strangers had divided into organized groups. Some were clearly warriors, their bodies scarred and marked with the signs of many battles. Others appeared to be trackers, studying the ground with the intense focus of hunters following a specific trail. Most ominously, several figures seemed to be pointing directly toward his section of the cliff face, engaged in animated discussions that he could not hear but could easily interpret. They knew he was here. Whether they had found physical evidence of his presence or simply deduced it from the smoke and other signs, the conclusion was inescapable. This was not a coincidental encampment, it was a deliberate siege. They had come looking for something specific, and that something was almost certainly related to the infant, who now stirred restlessly on the bed of furs behind him. The realization brought with it a flood of tactical considerations that Crag's warrior training forced him to confront. His cave, while defensible, had only one entrance. If they managed to reach the ledge, he would be trapped with nowhere to retreat. His food and water supplies, already strained by the addition of Locke to his household, would not sustain a prolonged siege. Most critically, any fighting would put the infant at terrible risk. Even if Crag managed to defend the cave successfully, the violence itself could harm or traumatize the child in ways that might never heal. But the alternative, surrender or flight, seemed equally impossible. Crag had no way of knowing what these strangers intended for Locke. If they were the same people who had abandoned the infant to die, their return might mean they had decided to complete the task more directly. If they were enemies of Locke's original band, they might view the child as a valuable hostage, or simply as a burden to be eliminated. Either way, placing Locke in their hands felt like a betrayal of every protective instinct that had driven Crag to rescue the infant in the first place. As Locke began to wake, making the small sounds that indicated hunger and the need for attention, Crag faced the most difficult decision of his life. He could fight, almost certainly dying in the process, but possibly buying enough time for some miracle to save them both. Or he could try to negotiate, gambling that these strangers might be reasonable people who could be convinced to leave them in peace. Neither option offered much hope, but both were preferable to simply waiting passively for whatever fate the newcomers had planned. Locke's soft whimpering for his morning feeding provided a surreal counterpoint to the deadly tension that now surrounded their cave. Crag lifted the infant with hands that trembled slightly, not from weakness but from the overwhelming flood of emotions that threatened to break through his warrior's composure. As he prepared the familiar paste of pre-chewed meat, his ears remained constantly tuned to the sounds from below, the distant murmur of voices, the crack of breaking wood as fires were fed, the occasional sharp call that might signal the beginning of an assault. "Eat well, little wolf," Crag whispered as Locke eagerly accepted the offered food. "You may need your strength today." The words carried a weight that the infant could not possibly understand, but Crag found comfort in the simple ritual of feeding, in the normalcy of caring for a dependent child, even as their world prepared to explode into violence. As the morning wore on, Crag noticed a change in the pattern of activity below. Where the large camp had initially seemed chaotic and random, it was now organizing itself into something far more purposeful and threatening. Groups of warriors were spreading out along the base of the cliff, establishing positions that would allow them to cover every possible escape route. Others were beginning the dangerous climb up the mountain face, moving with the careful precision of experienced hunters who had tracked prey to its final refuge. But it was the appearance of a single figure that truly chilled Crag's blood and confirmed his worst fears about the nature of this confrontation. Standing apart from the main group, positioned on a boulder that provided a clear view of the entire cliff face, was a hominid unlike any of the others. Even at a distance, this individual commanded attention through sheer presence and bearing. Tall and powerfully built, With the distinctive scarring and ornaments that marked a war leader, this figure studied the mountain with the patient intensity of a predator that knew its prey was trapped. The watcher's gaze seemed to sweep methodically across every ledge, every crevice, every possible hiding place along the cliff face. When those distant eyes passed over the area near Crag's cave, they lingered for long moments, as if drawn by some invisible sign of habitation. The scrutiny felt like a physical touch, invasive and threatening, and Crag found himself instinctively pulling back deeper into the shadows of his refuge. Through careful observation over the course of several hours, Crag began to piece together the structure and purpose of the force arrayed against him. The large band was clearly composed of multiple family groups, united under the leadership of the scarred watcher, who continued his patient surveillance of the cliff. Their weapons were well maintained and diverse, not just the simple spears and clubs of desperate hunters, but also sophisticated bolas, throwing sticks, and what appeared to be fire-hardened wooden shields that spoke of organized warfare rather than opportunistic raiding. Most ominously, several members of the band were engaged in activities that could only be preparation for a siege. They were gathering dried wood and kindling, far more than would be needed for cooking fires. They were constructing what looked like ladders from lashed branches. Most telling of all, they were positioning large stones at strategic points along their perimeter, stones that could be hurled upward with devastating effect if they located their target's exact position. The tactical picture that emerged from these observations was grimly clear. This was not a group that intended to negotiate or offer terms. They had come prepared for a prolonged assault, equipped to dig their prey out of whatever refuge it had found. The only question that remained was how they had located Crag so precisely, and why they were willing to invest so much time and effort in what should have been a simple elimination of a lone exile. The answer came as Crag watched a small group break away from the main camp and begin ascending a different section of the cliff face. Unlike the warriors who were moving to establish assault positions, these climbers carried no weapons. Instead, they moved with the careful purpose of people following a specific trail, stopping frequently to examine the stone surface and conferring among themselves in voices too distant to understand but urgent enough to carry ominous implications. They were trackers, following sign that Crag had left during his rescue of Locke. The difficult descent and ascent with the infant in his arms, the drops of blood from scraped hands and knees, the disturbed vegetation where he had paused to rest, all of these had left a trail that experienced hunters could follow like a map leading directly to his door. His compassionate impulse to save the dying child had inadvertently provided his enemies with exactly the evidence they needed to locate his sanctuary. As the trackers drew closer to his section of the cliff, Crag made a decision that went against every survival instinct he possessed. Instead of retreating deeper into the cave to hide, he moved closer to the entrance, positioning himself where he could observe their approach while remaining hidden in shadow. If they were going to find him anyway, he needed to know exactly when and how they would make their discovery. More importantly, he needed to understand their intentions toward Locke before deciding how to respond to their inevitable demand for surrender. The lead tracker was a lean, weathered hominid whose movements spoke of decades spent reading the subtle signs that others left behind. This hunter paused frequently, not just to examine the rock face but to test the air for scents, to listen for sounds that might reveal the location of their quarry. When he finally reached the narrow ledge that led to Crag's cave entrance, his body language changed completely. The careful searching gave way to confident certainty. He had found what he was looking for. From his position in the shadows, Crag could see the tracker's face clearly for the first time. What he saw there was not the expression of a warrior preparing for battle, or even the satisfaction of a hunter who had successfully cornered dangerous prey. Instead, the tracker's features showed something far more complex and troubling, a mixture of sadness, determination, and what might have been regret. This was not a killer savoring his moment of triumph. This was someone who had been tasked with a duty that brought him no joy, but which he was nevertheless committed to completing. The tracker turned and made a series of hand signals toward the camp below. Within moments, the lazy pattern of activity around the fires changed to urgent preparation. Warriors began gathering their weapons and forming into organized groups. The scarred leader stepped down from his observation post and began issuing orders that sent ripples of motion throughout the camp. Whatever had been planned for this confrontation was about to begin, and Crag knew that the next few hours would determine whether he and Locke lived to see another sunset. The silence that followed the tracker's signals seemed to stretch for an eternity. heavy with the weight of impending violence. Crag positioned himself at the cave entrance with his strongest spear in hand, while behind him, Locke slept peacefully, unaware that their small world was about to be torn apart. The contrast between the infant's innocent slumber and the deadly tension building outside made every breath feel like a betrayal of the peace they had briefly known together. Then, cutting through the mountain air like a blade, came a voice that carried the unmistakable authority of command. It was deep, resonant, and spoke in the formal cadences of a leader addressing an enemy, rather than negotiating with an equal. The words, though distant, were clear enough for Crag to understand their terrible meaning. "Crag of the Broken Stones," the voice called out, using the name of his birth band in a way that made his blood freeze. "We know you are there. We know what you have taken. Return the child to us, and your death will be swift and honorable. Continue to hide like a scavenger, and we will drag you from your hole to face justice for your crimes." The formal challenge confirmed Crag's worst fears about the nature of this confrontation. These were not random raiders or territorial competitors. They knew his name, his history, his band of origin. More chillingly, they knew about Locke and considered the infant to be something that had been taken rather than rescued. The implications sent waves of protective rage coursing through Crag's massive frame, his knuckles whitening as he gripped his weapon with barely controlled fury. A second voice joined the first, this one belonging to the scarred leader whose presence had dominated the camp below. Where the first speaker had used the formal tones of challenge and demand, this voice carried personal venom that cut far deeper than mere threats. "We know what you did to Mira, Kinslayer. We know how your cursed hands brought death to the one who trusted you most. Now you steal innocence from their rightful people, spreading your poison wherever you walk. This ends today." The words hit Crag like physical blows, reopening wounds that had never properly healed. But more than the pain they caused, these accusations revealed the true scope of the conspiracy that had brought so many warriors to his mountain refuge. This was not simply about Locke, it was about settling old scores, about punishing him for crimes both real and imagined, about silencing a voice that might someday tell a different version of the events that had led to his exile. "I took nothing that was not already dying," Crag roared back, his voice echoing off the stone walls with a force that surprised even him. "I found an abandoned child left to die by cowards who lacked the courage to face their responsibilities. If you want him, come and take him. But know that you will have to kill me first, and I will not die easily." The challenge hung in the air between them, a declaration of war that made further negotiation impossible. Crag could hear the immediate response from below, shouted orders, the sound of many feet moving across stone, the clatter of weapons being readied for assault. Whatever slim hope he might have harbored for a peaceful resolution died in that moment, replaced by the cold certainty that this would end in blood. Behind him, Locke stirred restlessly, disturbed by the shouting voices that had shattered the morning calm. The infant's small whimpering sounds provided a heartbreaking counterpoint to the sounds of approaching violence, reminding Crag of exactly what was at stake in the coming battle. This was no longer about his own survival. It was about protecting an innocent child who had already suffered far too much at the hands of those who should have cared for him. The first assault came sooner than Crag had expected, launched by climbers who had worked their way up the cliff face under cover of the verbal exchange. 3 warriors appeared simultaneously at different points along the ledge leading to his cave, their approach coordinated with military precision. They moved with the confident efficiency of fighters who had conducted similar assaults many times before, their weapons ready and their eyes focused on the cave entrance with predatory intensity. Crag met the first attacker at the narrowest point of the ledge, where the width of the path would limit his enemy's ability to use their numerical advantage. His spear thrust was powered by desperation and fury, driving deep into the warrior's chest before the man could bring his own weapon to bear. The mortally wounded attacker's scream echoed across the valley, serving both as a death cry and as a signal to his companions that the battle had begun in earnest. The second warrior was more cautious, having witnessed the fate of his companion. This fighter approached with shield raised and spear extended, testing Crag's defenses with careful probing attacks rather than committing to a decisive assault. For several minutes, they circled each other on the narrow ledge, each seeking an opening while being constantly aware that a single misstep could send them plummeting to the rocks below. It was the third attacker who proved most dangerous, approaching from an unexpected angle that forced Crag to divide his attention between multiple threats. This warrior had somehow managed to reach a position above the cave entrance, using handholds that Crag had not even known existed. From this elevated position, the attacker could rain down spear thrusts and thrown stones while remaining largely protected from retaliation. The tactical situation quickly became untenable. Fighting on multiple fronts while protecting the cave entrance was stretching Crag's abilities beyond their limits. Each successful defense against one attacker left him momentarily vulnerable to the others. His massive strength and superior reach were advantages, but they could not compensate indefinitely for being outnumbered and outmaneuvered by experienced warriors who had clearly planned this assault with careful attention to detail. More troubling than the immediate tactical crisis was the realization that this was only the beginning. Crag could hear additional climbers making their way up the cliff face, could see the smoke from signal fires that were coordinating the assault from below. Even if he managed to defeat these first attackers, there would be others to take their place. The enemy had committed to this battle with overwhelming force, and they would not be deterred by the loss of a few warriors. As he parried a spear thrust from the cautious second attacker and dodged a thrown stone from the warrior above, Crag caught a glimpse of Locke through the cave entrance. The infant was awake now, crying with the distressed wails of a child who sensed danger but could not understand its source. Those cries cut through Crag's heart more deeply than any weapon could, reminding him that failure here would mean not just his own death, but the abandonment of the helpless child who had come to depend on him for everything. The battle intensified as more attackers reached the ledge, transforming Crag's defensive position from difficult to nearly impossible. His massive frame, which had been an advantage in single combat, now worked against him as he struggled to maneuver in the confined space while facing enemies from multiple directions. Blood flowed freely from several wounds, none mortal yet, but each one sapping his strength and slowing his reactions by precious fractions of seconds. The warrior above the cave entrance had proven particularly troublesome, raining down a constant barrage of stones and short spears that forced Crag to fight with his shield raised, limiting his offensive capabilities. Every time he tried to press an attack against the enemies on the ledge, projectiles from above would drive him back, creating opportunities for the ground-level attackers to advance closer to the cave mouth. It was during one of these forced retreats that Crag heard a sound that chilled him more than any battle cry or weapon clash. Locke's crying had stopped, not the gradual quieting of a child who had found comfort, but the sudden silence that spoke of either unconsciousness or worse. The possibility that his infant charge might have been struck by a stray projectile or somehow harmed during the chaotic fighting sent a surge of berserker rage through Crag's veins. "You want the child?" Crag roared, his voice carrying a quality of fury that made even the experienced warriors hesitate. "Then come closer and take him." The challenge was accompanied by a devastating assault that caught his enemies off guard. Moving with reckless abandon, Crag drove his spear completely through the shield of the cautious second attacker, the point emerging from the warrior's back in a spray of blood and splintered wood. But the berserker charge that had eliminated one enemy left Crag exposed to the others. The warrior above the cave entrance seized the opportunity to leap down onto Crag's back, driving a bone knife toward the big hominid's neck. Only Crag's thick muscles and quick reflexes saved him from immediate death, but the blade still opened a long gash along his shoulder that sent blood streaming down his arm. Wrestling with the attacker on his back while trying to fend off the remaining ground-level enemies pushed Crag beyond the limits of even his extraordinary physical capabilities. The knife wielder was strong and experienced, maintaining his grip despite Crag's attempts to dislodge him. Meanwhile, two more warriors had reached the ledge, fresh and uninjured, while Crag grew weaker with each passing moment. The tide of battle had clearly turned against him. Crag could feel his strength ebbing, could sense his reactions slowing as blood loss and exhaustion took their toll. The realization that he was going to die, and that Locke would be left defenseless, filled him with a despair deeper than any physical pain. All his efforts, all his sacrifice, all the love he had discovered in caring for the abandoned infant would end here on this bloody ledge. It was then that something extraordinary happened. From inside the cave came a sound that had not been heard since the battle began. Locke's voice, not crying in distress, but making the soft cooing sounds that indicated contentment and recognition. The infant was alive, unharmed, and somehow still capable of the trusting vocalizations that had become so precious to Crag during their days together. The knowledge that Locke was safe, combined with the innocent trust implied by those gentle sounds, triggered something primal and unstoppable in Crag's warrior spirit. This was no longer just about survival. It was about protecting the one pure and innocent thing in his life, the small being who had given his existence meaning beyond mere day-to-day endurance. With a roar that seemed to shake the very mountains, Crag reached back and grabbed the knife wielder by the throat, his massive hand closing with crushing force around the attacker's windpipe. The warrior's surprised gurgle was cut short as Crag's grip tightened, vertebrae separating with an audible crack. Without pause, Crag hurled the lifeless body off the ledge, sending it tumbling into the valley below as a message to any who might be watching. The remaining attackers on the ledge hesitated, suddenly aware that they were facing something beyond a normal warrior defending his territory. This was a father protecting his child, a bond that transcended rational calculation and made him infinitely more dangerous than they had anticipated. The hesitation lasted only moments, but it was enough for Crag to seize the initiative. Moving with renewed purpose despite his wounds, Crag advanced on the nearest enemy. His spear work was no longer the careful defensive fighting of a cornered animal. It was the aggressive assault of a predator who had decided that the best defense was the complete elimination of all threats. The warrior tried to retreat, but the narrow ledge offered nowhere to go. Crag's spear took him in the chest, driving him backward off the cliff in a fall that ended with a distant, echoing crash. The last attacker on the ledge, seeing his companions dead or fallen, made a desperate attempt to reach the cave entrance. If he could get to the infant, he might be able to use the child as leverage to force Crag's surrender. But the big hominid was no longer thinking tactically. He was operating on pure protective instinct. The attacker's lunge toward the cave was met by Crag's full body weight, the impact driving both combatants perilously close to the edge of the precipice. For a terrifying moment, they grappled on the very brink of the cliff, each trying to push the other over while maintaining their own precarious balance. The warrior was skilled and desperate, fighting with the fury of someone who knew death was moments away. But Crag's motivation was stronger. With a final explosive effort, he broke the grapple and drove his knee into his opponent's solar plexus, doubling the warrior over in breathless agony. The follow-up blow, delivered with the pommel of Crag's bone knife, sent the attacker toppling backward into empty air, his scream Dopplered away as he fell, ending abruptly when his body struck the rocks hundreds of feet below. Suddenly, impossibly, the ledge was clear of enemies. Crag stood alone among the blood and scattered weapons, his chest heaving with exhaustion and his body trembling from the aftermath of combat. But even as he savored this momentary victory, Crag could hear the sounds of more climbers approaching from below. The assault had been repelled, but not defeated. His enemies had committed too much to this battle to be deterred by the loss of a few warriors. They would keep coming, wave after wave, until either he was dead or they had exhausted their supply of fighters willing to risk the dangerous ascent. Crag stumbled back into the cave, his body screaming with pain from multiple wounds, but his spirit lifted by the sound of Locke's gentle babbling. The infant lay on his bed of furs, apparently unharmed by the violence that had raged just outside their sanctuary. Those innocent dark eyes followed Crag's movements with the trust and recognition that had become the foundation of their relationship, offering a moment of peace in the midst of the continuing crisis. "Still safe, little wolf," Crag whispered, his voice rough with exhaustion and emotion. "Still together." He quickly checked the infant for any signs of injury from falling debris or stray projectiles, but found nothing more serious than the normal discomfort of a child who needed feeding and attention. The resilience of this small life, surviving abandonment and now violence, filled Crag with renewed determination to protect what had become most precious to him. But the respite was brief. From below came the unmistakable sounds of the next assault being organized. Voices called out tactical instructions, equipment was redistributed among fresh fighters, and the steady scraping of hands and feet on stone indicated that more climbers were already beginning their ascent. Crag's victory over the first wave had been costly to his enemies, but it had also revealed his capabilities and limitations. The next attack would be better planned and more carefully executed. Moving to the cave entrance despite his wounds, Crag surveyed the valley below and felt his heart sink at what he saw. The large camp had been reorganized into what could only be described as a military operation. Groups of warriors were being equipped with longer ropes and grappling hooks that would allow them to approach the cave from previously inaccessible angles. Others carried bundles of what appeared to be oil-soaked torches, a clear indication that they were prepared to use fire as a weapon if necessary. Most ominously, the scarred leader who had challenged him earlier was now positioned where he could observe the entire assault. This commander's calm demeanor and methodical approach to the problem suggested that the loss of several warriors was merely an acceptable cost in achieving a larger objective. There would be no retreat, no reconsideration of tactics based on initial setbacks. This force would continue its assault until either Crag was dead or they had exhausted their entire strength. The reality of his situation crashed over Crag like a cold wave. Even if he could somehow defeat wave after wave of attackers, he was fighting a losing battle of attrition. Each combat sapped his strength, opened new wounds, and brought him closer to the moment when fatigue would overcome skill and determination. His enemies, by contrast, could afford to lose many warriors in pursuit of their goal. They had numbers, they had organization, and they had the tactical advantage of being able to choose when and how to engage. More troubling still was the question of what would happen to Locke if the inevitable occurred. The infant's survival depended entirely on Crag's protection and care. Without constant feeding, warmth and attention, the child would not last more than a few days. The very love that had driven Crag to such heroic efforts in defending their sanctuary had also created a vulnerability that his enemies could exploit with devastating effectiveness. As he wrestled with these grim calculations, Crag heard something that initially made no sense in the context of the battle raging around his mountain refuge. From the valley below came the sound of horns, not the simple bone instruments used for basic communication, but the deep resonant calls that could carry messages across vast distances. The sound pattern was complex and rhythmic, clearly conveying information rather than simply announcing presence or issuing challenges. The effect on the camp below was immediate and dramatic. The organized preparation for the next assault suddenly dissolved into confusion and urgent activity. Warriors who had been readying equipment for the climb instead began gathering weapons and forming defensive positions. The scarred leader abandoned his observation post and began issuing rapid orders that sent groups of fighters racing toward different sections of the valley perimeter. Straining his eyes to see what had caused this sudden change in priorities, Crag spotted movement on the distant ridges that surrounded the valley. At first, it appeared to be simply the play of shadows and light across the rocky terrain. But as he watched more carefully, the movement resolved into something far more significant. Figures moving with purpose along the high ground, approaching the valley from multiple directions simultaneously. The implications of this development sent hope surging through Crag's exhausted body. Whoever these newcomers were, their arrival had clearly disrupted his enemies' plans and forced them to reconsider their tactical priorities. The focused assault on his cave position had been abandoned in favor of preparing for a much larger confrontation. For the first time since the siege began, Crag was no longer the primary focus of hostile attention. The horn calls continued, now answered by similar sounds from the approaching figures on the ridges. The communication pattern suggested coordination between groups that had been separated but were now converging on a predetermined target. This was not a chance encounter or coincidental arrival. It was a planned operation that had been timed to interrupt the assault on Crag's position. As the morning progressed, the nature of the approaching force became clearer. These were not random hunters or a rival band seeking territorial advantage. The approaching groups moved with military precision and appeared to be equipped for serious combat. Most importantly, their numbers seemed to at least match those of Crag's besiegers, transforming what had been a siege into something approaching a fair fight. The scarred leader below was clearly struggling to adapt to this unexpected development. His force had been organized and equipped for a specific mission, eliminating a lone exile and recovering an infant. They were not prepared for a major battle against an equal or superior force that had chosen the timing and approach of the engagement. The tactical advantage that had seemed so overwhelming when focused on Crag's isolated position was rapidly evaporating as new threats emerged from every direction. From his vantage point high above the valley floor, Crag could see the approaching forces, taking positions that would allow them to control the main escape routes from the valley. The besieging force was being surrounded, just as they had surrounded him, trapped in a position where their numbers would work against them rather than providing an advantage. The hunters were becoming the hunted, and the predators were discovering what it felt like to be prey. As he watched this dramatic reversal unfold, Crag felt a mixture of relief and puzzlement. Relief because the immediate threat to Locke had been diminished, at least temporarily. Puzzlement because he could not understand why anyone would risk so much to intervene in what should have been a private matter between him and his enemies. The answer to that question would determine whether this development represented salvation or simply a new and different form of danger for him and the child he had sworn to protect. The battle that erupted in the valley below was unlike anything Crag had witnessed during his years of exile. What had begun as a siege against his isolated position had transformed into a massive confrontation between two well-organized forces, each fighting with the desperate intensity of warriors who understood that defeat meant death or worse. The sound of clashing weapons, battle cries and screams of the wounded echoed off the mountain walls in a cacophony that spoke of violence on a scale rarely seen among the scattered hunter-gatherer bands of the region. From his elevated position, Crag could observe the ebb and flow of combat with the detached perspective of someone who was no longer the primary target. The scarred leader who had commanded the siege was proving to be a formidable tactician, quickly reorganizing his scattered forces into defensive formations that took advantage of the rocky terrain. But the attacking force had clearly planned this intervention carefully, approaching from multiple directions simultaneously and coordinating their assault with the precision of warriors who had fought together many times before. What puzzled Crag most about the unfolding battle was the restraint shown by both sides when it came to the use of fire. Despite the presence of prepared torches and oil-soaked materials, neither force seemed willing to risk setting the valley ablaze. This suggested that both groups had reasons for wanting to preserve the area intact, rather than simply destroy everything within reach. For Crag, this restraint might mean the difference between survival and being burned out of his cave refuge. As the morning wore on, it became increasingly clear that the attacking force was gaining the upper hand. Their superior positioning and coordinated tactics were gradually wearing down the resistance of the besieging army. Groups of the scarred leader's warriors began attempting to retreat from the valley, only to find their escape routes blocked by enemy fighters who had anticipated such movements. What had begun as an organized military operation was slowly deteriorating into a desperate struggle for survival. It was during one of the most intense phases of the battle that Crag noticed something that made his heart race with a mixture of hope and disbelief. Among the attacking forces, moving with the confident authority of a war leader, was a figure he recognized despite the distance and the chaos of combat. The distinctive gait, the particular way of holding weapons, the commanding presence that drew other warriors to follow. All of these characteristics belonged to someone from his past who should not have been anywhere near this remote mountain valley. Grun, his former hunting partner, his closest friend during the years before Mira's death, the one person who had spoken in his defense when the accusations and exile had torn his life apart. Grun, who had been forbidden by the band's elders from maintaining any contact with the cursed exile, was now leading a rescue force that had traveled great distances to reach this isolated battlefield. The recognition sent waves of conflicting emotions through Crag's exhausted mind. Joy at seeing a familiar face, gratitude for intervention that had saved both his and Locke's lives, confusion about how Grun had known to come here, and fear about what obligations this rescue might entail. Nothing in the harsh world of hunter-gatherer survival came without cost, and Crag had learned to be suspicious of any assistance that seemed too providential to be coincidental. As if sensing Crag's observation from the heights above, Grun paused in his direction of the battle and looked up toward the cliff face. Even at that distance, the moment of eye contact was unmistakable, a connection between two warriors who had shared too many hunts and dangers to mistake each other's presence. Grun raised his spear briefly in a gesture that could have been greeting, challenge, or simple acknowledgement, then returned his attention to the tactical situation developing around him. The battle's conclusion came with surprising swiftness once the tide had clearly turned. The scarred leader, seeing his force disintegrating under coordinated pressure from multiple directions, made the difficult decision to order a general retreat. The surviving members of his war party abandoned their equipment and wounded comrades in a desperate flight toward the valley's northern exit, the only escape route that remained partially open. Grun's forces could have pursued and annihilated the fleeing enemies, but instead they allowed the retreat to proceed without harassment. This merciful restraint suggested that the intervention had been motivated by specific objectives rather than general hostility toward the defeated force. The goal had been to relieve the siege, not to eliminate every member of the opposing army. Such tactical restraint spoke of leadership that understood the long-term consequences of excessive violence in the interconnected world of regional hunter-gatherer politics. With the immediate danger past, Crag faced a new and equally complex challenge. Grun's intervention had saved their lives, but it had also destroyed the isolation that had been his only protection since exile. His location was now known to a large group of warriors, his circumstances had been exposed, and most critically, the existence of Locke was no longer a secret that could be hidden indefinitely. As he watched Grun's fighters beginning to secure the valley and tend to their wounded, Crag realized that the next few hours would determine not just his immediate future, but the entire trajectory of his and Locke's lives. The battle had been won, but the war for their independence had only just begun. Whether Grun's arrival represented salvation or simply a different form of captivity remained to be seen. Looking down at Locke, who had somehow slept through much of the violent confrontation, Crag felt the familiar surge of protective love that had driven him to such extremes of courage and sacrifice. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever obligations or restrictions Grun's intervention might impose, his commitment to the infant's welfare remained absolute. They had survived abandonment, starvation, and siege together. Now they would face whatever came next as a family, bonded by shared suffering and mutual dependence in ways that transcended the normal relationships of their harsh world. The sound of voices calling his name from the valley below interrupted his contemplation. The confrontation with his rescuers could no longer be delayed. Taking a deep breath and gathering Locke carefully in his arms, Crag prepared to descend from his mountain sanctuary to face whatever judgment awaited him in the world he had left behind. The chapter of their lives defined by isolation and desperate survival was ending. What would replace it remained to be written in the choices and chances of the days ahead. The descent from his cave sanctuary felt like a journey between worlds for Crag. With Locke secured against his chest in a sling fashioned from strips of hide, he made his way carefully down the treacherous path that had been his only connection to the outside world for so many seasons. Each step took him further from the isolation that had defined his existence since exile and closer to a confrontation with the social bonds and obligations he had thought permanently severed. Grun waited at the base of the cliff, surrounded by a handful of his most trusted warriors, but clearly intending to conduct this reunion as a private matter rather than a public spectacle. The years since their last meeting had marked both men heavily. Grun's face bore new scars, his frame had filled out with the solid muscle of a seasoned war leader, and his eyes carried the weight of responsibilities that had not existed during their younger days as hunting partners. But beneath these changes, Crag could still recognize the steady, reliable friend who had once shared countless dangers and victories in the wild places of their world. "Brother," Grun said simply, using the formal greeting reserved for warriors who had saved each other's lives in combat. The word carried layers of meaning, acknowledgement of their shared past, recognition of the distance that exile had created between them, and perhaps most importantly, acceptance of Crag's right to exist, despite the accusations and judgments that had driven him from their people. "Brother," Crag replied, his voice thick with emotions he had thought buried forever. "You came far from home to find me. The elders will not approve of such association with accursed exile." The warning was genuine. Grun's intervention would not go unnoticed or unpunished by those who had decreed Crag's banishment. By coming here, by bringing warriors into battle on Crag's behalf, Grun was risking his own position and possibly his life. "The elders are dead," Grun replied with a flatness that carried devastating implications. "All of them, killed in the plague that swept through the southern valleys during the last cold season. Along with them died half our band, including many who called for your exile." The news struck Crag like a physical blow, overwhelming him with conflicting feelings of grief for the lost, guilt for the relief he felt at their deaths, and confusion about what this catastrophe meant for his own status. Grun continued, his voice carrying the weariness of someone who had struggled to hold together a community devastated by loss. "Those who survived looked to me for leadership. I told them the truth about Mira's death, how you tried to save her, how the mammoth's charge was impossible to predict, how the accusations against you were born of grief and fear rather than evidence. There are some who still harbor resentment, but most now understand that you were made a scapegoat for a tragedy that no one could have prevented." The revelation that his name had been cleared, that the curse of Kinslayer had been lifted from his reputation, should have filled Crag with joy. Instead, he felt only a hollow numbness, as if the vindication had come too late to matter. 3 seasons of exile had changed him in fundamental ways, stripping away the social connections and tribal identity that had once defined his existence. He was no longer the same person who had been unjustly banished. He had become something new, something that might not fit back into the world he had been forced to leave. "And the child?" Grun asked, his eyes focusing on the small bundle secured against Crag's chest. "The ones who besieged you claimed he was stolen from them, that you had taken him by force or trickery. What is the truth of this accusation?" The question was asked with the careful neutrality of a leader gathering facts rather than making judgments, but Crag could sense the importance of his answer in determining how this reunion would proceed. "I found him dying," Crag replied, his hand moving protectively over Locke's small form. "Abandoned on the rocks below my cave, starving and alone. No band, no parents, no sign of anyone who cared whether he lived or died. I fed him, nursed him back to health, gave him the love and protection that his own people had denied him. If that constitutes theft, then I am guilty as charged, but I will not apologize for saving an innocent life." Grun studied Crag's face carefully, reading the truth in expressions that had become familiar during their years of friendship and partnership. The protective stance, the fierce dedication, the willingness to die rather than abandon his charge. All of these spoke of genuine love rather than opportunistic kidnapping. More importantly, they revealed how completely Crag had committed himself to this new relationship, regardless of the costs or consequences. "The band that besieged you calls themselves the Blood Wolves," Grun explained, his voice taking on the tone of someone sharing intelligence about a known enemy. "They are not the child's original people. They are raiders and slavers who have been expanding their territory by absorbing weaker groups through conquest and intimidation. The scarred leader who challenged you is called Scarai, a war chief known for his cruelty and his practice of taking children from conquered bands to raise as warriors loyal only to him." The information cast the recent siege in an entirely different light. Locke had not been rescued from his rightful family. He had been saved from becoming a weapon in the hands of people who viewed children as tools rather than treasures. The thought of what would have happened to the innocent infant if Scarai's forces had succeeded in their assault filled Crag with a retroactive rage that made his hands tremble. "They will return," Grun continued, his tactical mind already calculating future threats. "Scarai does not accept defeat gracefully, and the loss of face from this failure will demand some form of revenge. You cannot remain here, isolated and vulnerable to another assault. But you also cannot simply return to our band with the child. There are still those who would view his presence as dangerous, a reminder of old conflicts and accusations." The dilemma was clear and seemingly insurmountable. Crag could not stay where he was, could not return to his birth band, and could not find safety in any other established community that might be subject to pressure or attack from the Blood Wolves. The freedom and independence that exile had paradoxically provided were being stripped away by the very intervention that had saved his life. It was then that Grun proposed something that had clearly been planned long before their reunion in this valley. "There is another way," he said, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who had already worked out the details of a complex solution. "A new band is forming in the Northern Territories, made up of survivors from groups that have been scattered by disease, warfare, and the changing climate. They seek experienced hunters and warriors who can help them establish a secure homeland in regions that others have abandoned as too dangerous or remote. They would welcome someone with your skills, and they would not question the presence of an adopted child who clearly brings you joy and purpose." The offer represented a path forward that Crag had not dared to imagine, a chance to rebuild his life in a new place, with new people who had no knowledge of his past or investment in old accusations. A place where Locke could grow up safely, surrounded by a community that would accept him as Crag's son, rather than viewing him as a source of conflict or danger. It was the possibility of healing, of moving beyond the tragedies and mistakes that had defined his recent existence. The journey north took them through territories that Crag had never seen before, lands where the familiar landmarks of his childhood and exile gave way to new vistas of possibility and hope. Traveling with Grun's band provided a security that Crag had almost forgotten existed, the comfort of sleeping surrounded by allies, the shared labor of hunting and gathering, the simple pleasure of voices around an evening fire that spoke of community rather than isolation. Locke thrived during the journey, responding to the attention and stimulation of being surrounded by people who viewed him not as a source of conflict, but as a delightful addition to their traveling family. The infant's laughter, once heard only by Crag during their quiet moments in the cave, now echoed through the camps they made each evening. Children from other families in the group began to seek out opportunities to play with the baby, and their parents offered advice and assistance that reminded Crag how much he had been forced to learn through trial and error during their isolation. The transformation in Crag himself was equally remarkable. The defensive wariness that had characterized his interactions with others gradually gave way to a cautious openness that allowed new friendships to develop. Warriors who had initially viewed him with suspicion because of his reputation as an exile came to respect his skills and appreciate his dry humor around the evening fires. More importantly, they accepted his absolute devotion to Locke without question or judgment, recognizing in that bond something pure and valuable that transcended the normal boundaries of kinship. 3 weeks into their journey, they reached the valley that would become their new home. It was a place of stunning natural beauty, with clear streams, abundant game, and defensible positions that would allow a growing community to establish itself safely. The existing members of the new band, survivors from a dozen different groups that had been scattered by various disasters, welcomed the newcomers with the pragmatic enthusiasm of people who understood that their survival depended on cooperation and mutual support. The integration into this new community proceeded more smoothly than Crag had dared to hope. His hunting skills were immediately recognized and valued, his tactical knowledge proved useful in planning the band's defenses, and his experience with child-rearing, limited though it was, made him a valuable resource for other families with young children. Most importantly, his relationship with Locke was accepted as completely normal, requiring no explanation or justification beyond the obvious love and care they showed for each other. As the seasons passed, Crag watched Locke grow from the starving infant he had rescued into a healthy, curious toddler who explored their new world with fearless enthusiasm. The child's first words included "Papa," directed at Crag with an unconscious certainty that brought tears to the big warrior's eyes. His first steps were taken across the floor of their new dwelling, arms outstretched toward the man who had become his entire universe of safety and love. The threat of the blood wolves, while never entirely forgotten, gradually receded into background concern as the new band established itself and formed alliances with neighboring groups. Scar Eye's raiders preferred to target isolated and vulnerable communities, not well-defended settlements that could call upon multiple allied bands for support. The network of relationships that Grun had helped to establish provided a level of security that made future attacks highly unlikely to succeed. 2 years after their arrival in the Northern Valley, Crag stood on a hill overlooking their thriving community and reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. Below him, children played in the stream while their parents worked on various tasks necessary for communal survival. Locke, now a sturdy 3-year-old with an infectious laugh and an insatiable curiosity about everything around him, was building elaborate structures in the sand with a group of friends who had never known him as anything other than Crag's beloved son. The boy had no memory of his original abandonment or the desperate circumstances of his rescue. To him, Crag had always been Papa, the strong, gentle hands that fed him, the deep voice that sang him to sleep, the protective presence that made the world feel safe and welcoming. The traumatic beginning of his life had been completely erased by the love and security that had surrounded him since those first desperate days in the mountain cave. For Crag, the transformation was equally complete, but infinitely more conscious. The bitter exile who had lived in isolation, consumed by guilt and resentment, had been replaced by a man who understood that his greatest purpose lay in nurturing and protecting the innocent life that had been placed in his care. The curse that others had placed upon him, the accusation of bringing death wherever he walked, had been definitively broken by his choice to preserve life instead of merely surviving it. That evening, as Locke fell asleep in the warm security of their dwelling, Crag told him the story that had become their bedtime ritual. Not the harsh truth of abandonment and near death, but a gentler version that spoke of a brave little boy who had been waiting in the mountains for the right father to find him. A story of choice rather than chance, of love overcoming all obstacles, of the family they had created through mutual need and devotion. And they lived safely ever after, Crag concluded, as he did every night, his voice carrying the absolute certainty of someone who had fought too hard for happiness to take it for granted. Outside their dwelling, the sounds of a peaceful community settling into sleep provided a backdrop of security that seemed as permanent as the mountains themselves. Locke murmured sleepily against his father's chest, small fingers tangled in the coarse hair, that had once known only the touch of violence and survival. In the firelight, Crag could see the face that had grown so dear to him, no longer the skeletal mask of starvation he had first encountered, but the healthy glow of a child who had never known a day without love, food, and protection. The lone hominid who had once fed a starving orphan infant had discovered that salvation often comes disguised as responsibility. In choosing to save Locke, he had ultimately saved himself, transforming a life defined by isolation and regret into one filled with purpose, community, and the deepest joy he had ever known. The shadows that had once surrounded his cave with menace had been replaced by the gentle shadows of evening, falling on a place where they both belonged, where they were both safe, where they would always be family.